Oh, no. Okay.
Yes. So welcome to Dynamics Meetup Deutschland or Germany for May. We have today with us three speakers actually. Two in the first session, Ievgen and Ludwig. Ievgen, am I saying your name correct? Not sure.
Yep.
Fine. Yeah. Okay. And you will be telling about tamper-proof document storage. And then we have Andre, who will be telling us about security in Dynamics. And in the end, we will talk about our next sessions and what we have there and if there's any new topics to discuss. So the organization team is Ludwig, Ievgen, and me. And if you have anything you want to have on a meetup or you want to present something, please let us know. You can find us on LinkedIn. And for tonight, let's remember to mute the microphones when someone is speaking, unless you have comments, discussions, or questions. And you can also put them in the chat. And only come with constructive input, so people want to come and do sessions again, because we all want to learn from each other, and do not make a lot of advertising here. That's our basic rules. The next meetup will be the 23rd of June, same time as usual, and we have Stefan and Tomislav who will be covering something from Power Platform, and then we have Johan Hoffman from Microsoft Denmark who will give us an overview of warehouse processes for manufacturing in Dynamics 365 supply chain. So let's move on to Ludwig and Ievgen. I don't know which one of you is going to share your screen.
Yeah, I start first and then Ievgen takes over. So let's try. And you have to give me a sign that you see my screen.
It's working. And would you prefer to have questions in the chat, or should we just ask, or ask after?
I don't know.
Okay.
Just ask. Just because we will switch screens a lot and show some stuff, so feel free just to unmute yourself and ask questions straight ahead.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so welcome to our demo and presentation about tamper-proof document storage and handling of documents around Dynamics. So let me try to see. Yeah, Ievgen, you're the first one who has to make the introduction, and then it's me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ievgen. I'm a technical person based here in New Zealand. Used to be an MVP back in the days. Yeah, that's me.
Okay, and then that's me. Ludwig, I was also an MVP, and now I'm a functional person working for Microsoft. Okay, so for today's topic, we prepared a couple of slides that give you an introduction into this topic. And the first thing that we want to talk about are the regulations. And these regulations that we list, they apply to what we call DACH region. And you can ask me, what does DACH mean? D basically stands for Deutschland, A for Austria, and CH for Switzerland. And DACH is usually the top of a house, and therefore we just call it DACH region. And when it comes to these countries, we have a couple of regulations that deal with the document storage. And the first one is the commercial code. In Germany, we call it HGB. In Austria and Switzerland, it has similar names, but it's a commercial code that applies for many companies. Then we have the tax code. So all of the tax regulations, they stipulate how you have to store and handle your documents. And then we have general accounting principles. And in most countries, we also have statements or regulations from institutes of auditors. In Germany, it's the IDW. In Switzerland and Austria, we have similar organizations and so on. Yeah? So they are really a bundle of regulations that say how you have to handle your documents. And if you want to put it together in a single box or a sentence, then there are a couple of important things that you have to take care of. Yeah. So first of all, this audit security, or we call it the tamper-proof document storage, focuses on the procedure. Yeah? So it's not only that you need a technical thing or feature to store the document, but the whole process is taken into consideration when an auditor or tax advisor comes and wants to see your solution. Yeah? And what we highlighted in yellow color here is important. Yeah? The essential part is here that the feature of audit-proof archiving systems is the way how we store the information in a way that it can be found, traced in an unchangeable manner. And that's what we call tamper-proof. Okay, so now we thought about Dynamics 365 and what are the issues that we have with these regulations. And the first issue is that the out-of-the-box SharePoint connection that we have with Dynamics 365 F&O, it does not really guarantee a tamper-proof storage of documents. There are many ISV partners, companies that extend SharePoint, but out of the box, if you just use it, what is available, then this does not fully guarantee this required document storage. Then these ISV solutions that we talked about, they are often expensive. And what we want to have is, of course, something easy to implement and out of the box. Then we have, when we talk about document storage and third-party systems, you often get ISV solutions that are built for a specific purpose. Store documents and make sure nobody falsifies them. But they cannot extend to other applications. So they cannot verify whether an attachment to an email or some other numbers that you store have not been changed or modified. Then the next point is actually a note from Ievgen, who said the database log that we have in Dynamics 365. So if we use the database log as a kind of tool to help us securing documents, then this one is not tamper-proof because you can actually delete it as an admin. And finally, we have the verification tools for document processing on SharePoint or Dynamics 365 are missing. So these are a couple of issues that we have with standard out-of-the-box solutions. And then we came across one specific topic that I read about. It is called Azure Confidential Ledger. And I do not want to talk much about. Here we have some links for you if you are interested. And there was this nice graphic that I found, but I did not understand it. So I asked Ievgen, and Ievgen, I think from now on you have to take over and help us understanding this.
Yep. So it's actually, there are two different ways how you can use Azure Confidential Ledger. First of all, what is Azure Confidential Ledger? That's, in a simple word, that's a solution built on a blockchain. So you can use a blockchain to store any sort of information. And by default, using blockchain, you can go and backtrack everything and it's protected from a change. And why I'm saying two ways, because you can use Azure Confidential Ledger directly. It has an API and you can store documents there. And once document is written, you get transaction ID back, and having the transaction ID, you can find, retrieve a document and retrieve all the history. But that's if you want to store a file or some piece of information directly in a blockchain, you can use Azure Confidential Ledger. In our scenario, we will use SQL Server, and SQL Server has an integration with Azure Confidential Ledger. So you can activate Ledger feature on a SQL database. And whenever you write data into your table, it will calculate hash of a record and store that hash automatically in Ledger. This way you don't duplicate data between SQL and a blockchain, your document could be stored, or document any sensible information could be stored in a SQL table, and you can use all the tools that you usually use with SQL to report, query, and so on and so forth. And then using the ledger, you can prove that those records has not been changed. So that's one feature that we're gonna use today. And second one, when you create those ledger enabled tables in SQL, you can also say those tables are only for insert. It doesn't allow update or delete. And if someone will try to update data, it's just impossible. You will get an exception. So you can always only insert, append to the table, and it's really good when you store documents or transactions. And then hash of that is in blob or in a blockchain. So you can always validate that no one changed the SQL database, because it's still SQL database, and if you have writes, you can go and corrupt it, but you have a way to validate it. And now we're probably going to jump to the demo, and we will have two scenarios to show. First scenario, we will go through actually storing documents, metadata of the documents in Ledger, and second one, how we can verify that the document has been modified, or was it modified or not. And we will switch screens quite a bit. So we will start from Ludwig, who will play his accountant role, creating a document. And in our scenario, we will use SharePoint as a document storage. However, because we using Logic Apps and Power Platform under the hood, it could be any source. It could be emails, it could be OneDrive, anything that you have a connector for in Logic Apps. So going back to Ludwig.
Okay, so now my job is to find a document and to move it to my SharePoint drive. So I prepared an invoice, so Rechnung, a first one, and this could be a document that you generate in Dynamics. So it's actually one of the demo invoices that we have. It has an amount of 1,000, and here at the bottom it says it lists the bank account to which our company should make the payment. And that's what I want to falsify later on. Yeah. But now we just simulate that we got this document. So let me close it. And I have a SharePoint site here. I hope you can all see that. Yeah. If not, just give us a sign. This one is a document library called ACL vendor invoices. And to this one, I upload this document. So I say File, and then we select this one. I have to make it smaller. And then I say Open. And then you see here is the original invoice document that was generated. Okay, so this was my magic job, and now I have to hand over to Ievgen.
Let me share my screen. So one. So can you see it, or can everyone see it?
Yep.
So first part of our solution, we have a logic app that actually captures details of this document. And it's very simple in a way, very straightforward. It has only several steps. First one, that's a trigger. Whenever a document is created in a SharePoint list, we want to capture those details. So that's first step is a trigger. And we have just hard-coded SharePoint list that Ludwig was talking about. What we do, we capture document content and pass it to Azure function. That Azure function will calculate a hash of the document, and then it will pass it into our Ledger table. Here is a function. It's just several lines of code, and it just grabs binary stream from a document and calculates SH256 hash, and returns back. That's a simple piece, and it could be more sophisticated than that. It's just an example here. So first step is to trigger logic app once document is uploaded. And again, as I said before, in this case, it could be SharePoint. We have lots of triggers. It could be email. It could be OneDrive. It could be any document storage that you can think of and Microsoft supports. Then we calculate hash, and then we insert it into the table. And let's see how table looks like. So the last record here, That's a document passed to the document that Ludwig just created. That's a hash of the document, and we will use that hash further on to calculate it once the document is modified to see if it was corrupted or not. That's a timestamp, and that's a ledger transaction ID. That ledger transaction ID could be used to actually validate this record in Azure Confidential Ledger to check if database was corrupted or not. And that's a type of operation. So we're done with this part, and we're going back to Ludwig to actually change the document.
Okay, so let me first share my screen. So you see my screen again?
Yes.
Can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, wait a minute. I have to find something. Just a second. Okay. Okay. So now I try to change something here in the document. And let's say I want to change here this thing and change here the bank account number and maybe the big code. Yeah. Okay. So I've basically falsified this document because I want that the money goes to my bank account. So I close it. Yeah. And that's it basically. Okay. And now it's Ievgen's turn to take over again.
Give me a second to share my screen again. We'll see how we will validate it. And obviously I need as well a piece of equipment to see that we are going to validate it. Obviously, so we have another row here, and to investigate what our sneaky Ludwig has did a second ago. So here is the second logic app, and it's a bit more complicated. What it does is just a trigger recurrence. So idea behind it goes through all the records in our table that we saw before in this one. For each record in a SQL table, it tries to go to SharePoint and get file just to see if it's there. If file is not there, because Ludwig can go and delete it, it could be some important document, yeah, and he wants to get rid of it, we will record that piece of JSON into the file that will just say that file hasn't been found, that's the file that we were looking for, and that's what is a hash value in the database. So we will record in our variable that file is missing and it was deleted. If file is present, still there, we will go back and use the same function and calculate hash once again. Then we will compare hash stored in the database with hash calculated. And if hash is still the same, we will just do nothing because we can have too many documents, so we don't really want to report. But if you want, we can go and write to the same variable saying that old hash, new hash, they are equal, so all good with the document. And if hash is different, we will go and append the same variable and just say that there is an issue and there is a hash mismatch. Once we are done with all the documents, we check all of them, we will go and create HTML table. And that HTML table has all the details. In my existing table, we have 3 records from our two from previous demos and 1 from today. So for the first one, I had that invoice stored in the list and I deleted. So result is file not found. So I know that there was a document created, invoice in my example here, and someone went and deleted from a SharePoint. So we have found an issue here. Someone deleted a document. Second document was changed previously, and we have here hash mismatch. Found it, that's a current hash and an old hash. And that's the third document that we just created. And again, same story here. When we recorded it, we calculated hash, and that was a hash value that's stored in database. After the change was done by Ludwig, we went, ran a report, calculated current hash because content of the document has been changed. we get a new value and we have a mismatch. Now we have this data in a nice format, and then probably if you want, you can always add another step to email it to someone as a table and notify it. In this demo example, I'm using just a manual trigger, but it could be, how to say, scale recurrence. So you can have the logic app running daily that will go and check all your documents and report on any issues or mismatches. That's probably it about it. Another question here, how do we actually check that data in a SQL table, because it's just a SQL table, is still valid and it hasn't been compromised? For that, if you go back to SQL database, here somewhere on the security auditing tab, you have an option to actually run a script, maybe auditing. No, maybe security. Where is it? Yeah, verify database, and it will actually give you a script that you can copy, run against the database, and it will show you, it will go and check all the hash values back in a Azure Confidential Ledger in a blockchain, compare them, and give you a result saying that your database hasn't been corrupted, or it has been corrupted, so you have an issue with the data. And that's probably it with demo. Any questions so far?
Okay, then I take over again.
Yeah, so I have just a short one, if you may allow. Hey,
Yep.
My name is Dennis. So if you store it in a table, so obviously Ludwig would not be able to get access to the table, but so probably you will get to the point where you would save it in multiple tables to create a some kind of blockchain, right? So you would get to this point later. Okay, so let me put this clear. So Ludwig does not have access to the SQL table right now.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
but do you have, Ievgen?
Yes, but there's specific SQL. So it's that SQL database. It allows you to do only inserts. So you cannot update data in that database. And why we are doing that? Because there could be two culprits. Yeah, one could be actual accountant, for example, who wants to previous documents. However, you have a system admin that are responsible for SQL side of things, yeah, and you can just go and bribe him, and together you will compromise data in a document storage and in a SQL database. It's still possible. However, using Ledger feature on a SQL, you make sure that this table allows you only to do inserts, so no one can update data. And with Azure Confidential Ledger behind, you can always validate that data hasn't been compromised in any other way, because hash of that record is stored in blockchain, and you can always go and compare data in a SQL database with value in a blockchain. So there could be multiple applications to that. First one, what we're showing is to have actually metadata of a document stored in a SQL table. Second one, you can forget it for documents for a second, and you can just use this feature to validate transactional data in a SQL table itself. For example, you're recording your payment transactions or something like that. And when you do it, it's always insert. It's never modified. You never modify record of a payment. And if you have Ledger enabled, you can always check that those records of a payment in the SQL database are still valid. If it answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Okay, any other question? The difficult is for Ievgen. Okay, otherwise then let's move to my screen again. And we should be back at the PowerPoint. Okay, these were the criminals. And Ievgen, do you want to talk a bit through this?
Yep, I can just probably recap through what we saw. So there were two logic apps involved. First one to actually capture details. Yeah? And core components are document storage that could be SharePoint, OneDrive, anything. Then a function that we just showed that just calculates hash. Unfortunately, there's no other way except Azure function, as I'm aware, to calculate hash and see to capture metadata, because either we calculate hash or we grab the whole document and put it directly into confidential ledger. We can do that. We just don't want to duplicate documents into different storages. Third one is a SQL table, SQL database with ledger enabled, that allows us to quickly build a report. In my personal opinion, it's easier to go and iterate through SQL database and do all sorts of queries to actually audit it afterwards than work directly with the blockchain. And yeah, the last step is actually automatic, that feature that evolves, that automatically integrates SQL database with Azure Confidential Ledger and stores all the metadata there. And that's the first one to actually capture it. And second one that we just showed you was a logic app to validate, do the validation, and it's a bit more complicated. In this case, we took a simple approach. We are going through all the SQL records. So you have two options how you can do it. Yeah, you go either through document storage and check that all the documents are presented in your database and report some mismatches, or you could go from a SQL side and go and see what you have record and if there is some extra or missing documents in document storage. So in our case, we're starting from SQL, checking that, oh, yes, we have record recorded in a SQL. Let's go and check if it's in SharePoint. Because if it's been deleted, then someone is trying to compromise our documents. Yeah, the one. Yes, so if it's not there, we will record the fact that it was at some point someone created a document. We captured that metadata as soon as it was created using the trigger, and now it's deleted. So we want to record it in a variable. And then if it's there, we need to check that it's still has not been changed. We will go take value, content of the document, pass it to the same function that we used before, calculate hash, and store it in a SQL database. Yep. If hashes are identical, save it to the table, and send it to the auditor as a report.
Okay.
Yep. Demo has, yeah. Next one.
The next one. Yeah. Finally, they catch me basically. And yeah. So we talked also about other use cases where you can probably make use of that. And yeah. Okay. So we found that you can also apply the same idea or principle to bank payment files, credit card numbers, vendor bank data, audit log files, many other things. And Ievgen explained that this is not bound to SharePoint. You can use any kind of cloud storage to which we have connectors. Then we have insurance fraud protection. I think, Ievgen, you had a case somewhere in New Zealand. That was about the next one, the reuse of vouchers. So people use vouchers again and again and get discounts or something, right?
It was actually accelerated. You have internal procurement. You can get a gift card for something, and it goes through standard purchase order approval workflow. And once it gets approved, you get your document printed out from the system, and you just go and use it all the time. Because once approved, you go and say, my PO was approved. You just change a number and go and receive another one and another one and another one using the same PO, just modify number all the time.
Yeah, and a couple of other things is if you send documents from court or court proceedings through emails or other drives. Yeah, so there are many applications, and I think there are easy use cases. If you can make use of this Azure Confidential Ledger. And it's still in preview, as far as I know.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. But I think if the community here finds a couple of use cases and applications, then I think should go into general availability. Okay, so that's it basically. Do we have any other questions?
I think there's a question from Jonas in the chat. He wants to know if the code for the Azure function will be released.
Yeah, I just need to wait how can I release it, but yes, it's quite easy. Probably, yeah, we can post it somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah, I can post it to the chat if you want it, but yeah.
That would be fine.
Okay, and last thing. Okay, this is, I don't know who knows these Daltons, but yeah, that's the end of our story. Okay. So thanks a lot. I get rid of that and have my glasses again. Okay. Yeah.
I was thinking which kind of hat you would come back with when you went away, Ludwig. I just knew it was something. But thank you very much, and thank you for getting up so early for us, Ievgen, and presenting. So
Thank you all for having me.
Yeah.
it was amazing, and I know some people have asked for it, so there might be some more questions after we release the video on YouTube. So is it okay if I add your LinkedIn profile in the chat, Ievgen?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
I'm often receiving questions from our previous sessions from Ludwig, so yeah, all good.
Yeah. Good. Okay. But thank you, and then let's move on to and thank you to you also, Ludwig, of course, not only Ievgen.
Yeah, he did the work.
You did the talking, so
it was good. Yeah, and Andre, should we see if you can share your screen?
Yes, I will try to do it.
It works perfect.
Perfect. So first time I share it through Teams itself instead of presenting my screen. So.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't have any costumes today, so it will be a bit boring, but I'll try to make it an exciting topic for today. It's just about security administration for Microsoft Dynamics 365 for finance and operations. For those who are not familiar who I am, my name is André Arnaud de Galvon. I'm a Microsoft MVP currently. Let's hope for a renewal coming July, but you never know. And currently working as a solution architect for 2Increase. And I'm involved as a kind of product owner for several of our solutions, working on some really nice solutions to be released soon. We already made an announcement ready just recently. Very excited about the new things. It was also time to do some new things instead of just all the things we did before. 2Increase itself is a global ISV. We deliver additional software for Business Central finance operations, and also we have currently some solutions based on the PowerPoint on the Power Platform. My background: I started with Navision Financials in 1996. Did almost 5 years. Navision Financials is now known as Business Central, and as of 2001 until today, I only work with Axapta and now Finance Operations Solutions. If you want to have any questions or want to follow or reach out with some questions, just reach out to me. Today we will talk about the security. First, how are the users authenticated? What's the architecture of the security rules in a proper way? Not just limited knowledge, but we'll try to share the complete story. What are the differences in finance operations to be able to customize or configure security changes? Some part on the security implementation, some tips. Also, what's the license impact if you apply or change security? Some of the new options, maybe you've already seen it in the past years, but what is nearly added compared to AX 2012, and some part of the forgotten, hidden, and unknown features around security in finance and operations. So let's start with the user authentication. The user authentication itself is done by checking the users in the Azure Active Directory. That's for the cloud version of finance operations. So every user should be having an organizational account, being able to log in using Azure Active Directory and account. And at that moment, the user is authenticated. Then finance operations will also check for licenses. As part of the several years already, when Microsoft split the application in finance, supply chain, human resources, project operations, etc., it is kind of required to also assign the licenses to the persons in Azure Active Directory. Once the user is authenticated and a license has been assigned, the user can log in finance and operations. For on-premise, it's still using the Active Directory Federation services, but also to be able to connect to LCS for doing some updates on the machines. There is an Azure Active Directory account for the company required to do the maintenance. And next to just having the user, it should be set up in the application itself. Let's continue to the next part. In finance operations, for authentication, it will look at which users are set up in finance operations. And that's not the full story. I also wrote a blog about how to authenticate users using Azure Active Directory groups. But I will skip that one for today, assuming that we have the users in the application. In fact, if a user does not have any security role assigned, he will also not be able to see anything. So that means that everything is protected, not visible, unless you grant access via security roles in the application. Each security role consists of one or more duties, and each duty consists of one or more privileges. It's also possible to have privileges directly assigned to security roles. Is it recommended? Probably not. I'll come back to that one later as well. Each privilege, just how the most of the people know it, contains multiple menu items, also with an access level. Meaning, if you have a privilege for maintaining the customers, there might be a menu item access for the cust table menu item, display menu item, including also the permissions for delete, which means the person can have all security from being able to read, update, but also delete the record. And if you want to have view only, then on the privilege, you will link the menu item and just only with the read access. Then in that case, the user will not be able to add or update or delete data. But I used also the question here, is it this simple? And I will first make a warning. If there's anyone in a company saying, I will do the security for you, and that person can only tell this story, then I would send them away, because it's not this simple. It's not really only about menu items, privileges, duties, and security roles. But on the next slide, this is the complete picture. So if the user is not able to tell about the UI elements, maybe also the table and field permissions, how to deal with the reporting service operations, and I think I missed also here the data entities. They're also separately secured via privileges. So the menu items is just one part of a complete story. So it's also possible, like mentioned, not only the menu items, but UI elements. UI elements is also about form controls, meaning that if, for example, in a lot of forms do have the tab page for the default dimensions, default financial dimensions, set as a secureable object via property needed permission. And in that case, you can just also manage the security via the UI elements in the application. And next to it, you can also grant access on tables and fields. And next topic, it's the authorization part that will give access in the application. But for the data security, there's also a concept called extensible data security, where it would be possible to secure certain access to records, not individual fields of or columns of these records. That will be done via the table and the field permissions, but you can hide certain records. But you can also manage with the extensible data security that people might be able to see all records, but probably not able to change customers or add customers related to for example, customer group number 20. And also there's a table permissions framework, and on a Dynamics community, I see quite some questions stating, hey, I'm trying to run a report, but now I do get an error that I don't have access to the bank account field. What's wrong? Well, that is caused by the table permissions framework, short TPF. The table permissions framework is controlled with a property on the table, but also on the field level, called AOS authorization. When the AOS authorization is enabled, then it's part of the table permissions framework, meaning that for that table or the field, there should be explicit additional permissions granted on the privilege. Otherwise, the user will not be able to interact with that data. And usually the tables and fields which are protected out of the box by Microsoft is related to bank account information, but also credit card information and some other fields as well. So again, if someone is not able to tell more than only the menu items, that would probably not the best person to do the security implementation at a customer. I see some questions coming in. I will come back to a question later. I see a question from Jonas, but I first will talk about the differences between the security customizations via Visual Studio, or if you want to configure it, the security via the user interface. So we have an option for a customization and a configuration. And is the one better than the other? Not really. It depends on a kind of personal preferences. Like one person would like to drive a Volkswagen and another person would like to drive a Mercedes. The customizations are done in Visual Studio and the configuration is done in the Dynamics 365 client. That's one of the differences. And for that reason, also the customization part, that should be done by a developer, whereas the configuration part can be done by technical people or consultants, and not really having development skills. To be able to get your changes in other environments, like in testing and in production environments, with the customization option, you have to generate deployable package, just like any customization in the application. That also means that it will have some requirements for downtime and also a deployment time. Whereas with the configuration part, you can just export the security configuration, import it in another environment and do a publish to get it published in the application. And that can be done directly from a test environment to the production environment without any requirement to do any kind of regression testing, as you already validated it with just the configuration part. So that already mentioned the difference between just the customization and configuration part, also for the deployment time, and if you would like to publish it at any moment in control. Another major difference, and that might be also some kind of influencing the preferences. If you do customizations via Visual Studio, you can take advantages of the version control to know what are the changes in the roles across the time, or which roles were added or not. And the version control will be there forever automatically if you just check out and check in the objects. The version control is kind of mandatory for finance and operations, but still I know that there are still some companies who just try to skip the Azure DevOps and just have one development environment and create deployable packages out of Visual Studio, which is far from recommended. As with the version control, you can always just spin off a new development environment when the old one is crashed or unrecoverable. And with the new one, you just connect to your version control, get latest, and you can continue your development. For the configuration part, there's no version control. The only thing you can do is on runtime, probably export the full configuration and store it somewhere, probably on an Azure storage, using some blockchain, like we have seen in the previous session, ensuring that there are no changes and that we know that we can also compare those files later on to see what are the differences in time. When you're doing things in the Visual Studio, there are some options to know which objects, like which menu items are used in which privileges, or which privilege is used in what duty or security role. There's some where used tooling based on the cross-reference to be able to find the information. And when we are doing the configuration from the security changes from the configuration part, there's a task recorder option to just record every form you would like to have in a certain role. And the task recorder can then also give some information which menu items were hit, and using another option for security diagnostics. For task recorders, you can just find out what objects are used. I've seen things also being used in a hybrid way, meaning that the main part of the security was developed or just maintained via Visual Studio, and some parts via configuration, and the hybrid option is always possible. Also, if you did just deploy a new customization and you missed something and you really need to continue working, then at that time you can also do a configuration change in addition to ensure that the customers can, or the users can, just continue working. The result of having the deployable package with the security changes or using the configuration part will also kind of compile the objects and create a runtime extension on the application. But you're not able to get that back. But there's another person in the US called Alex Meyer. He created a tool where you would be able to export the configuration, and that tool could convert that configuration part back into Visual Studio objects. I'll go back. Oh, no, not back. Go further with the next part. For the implementation projects, Ensure that the security will be part of the project plan. Sometimes it's forgotten, but if there's no thoughts about the security, then for sure you will start too late. So also with the security, start in time, because it's not always straightforward. And if you don't start in time, it might result in you don't have the time, users needs to go live. And what we then see is that at that time, people will get the system administrator rights to perform the tasks. However, if they have the system administrator, then they bypass all security, and they can also just commit some fraud or make any other changes which are not required or just not desired in the application. If there are customizations, also ensure that the security is a mandatory section on each functional design. To increase what we do, well, we don't have a real functional design as we are working on a Scrum. What we do is we have an epic, and on the epic, we have a description like, as a user, I want to be able to perform this, to be able to do that. But we have also a section for acceptance criteria, and the security part is one of the mandatory parts also on our epics. And if we divide it into features and backlog items, also for each element, we specify what to do with the security. Also, when the users will do an acceptance test, try to do the testing as soon as possible with the correct security roles assigned. If you don't do the testing with the roles itself, then probably the person who configures the roles might think it's complete, but when a user will start testing it, he might find out that he is missing an inquiry form, for example, to see the voucher transactions. And if there's any error, sometimes people say, hey, I can't do it because then I don't know if there's a system failure or if it's related to security. Again, with the correct person in the company to do the implementation for the security, then it would be in 98% of the cases, it would be possible for that person to define if an error is related to security or if it's related to just a bug in the customization. So again, I'm not going to say it anymore, but ensure you have the correct resource to do the implementation or for customizing the security roles in the application. Also, prevent having too many roles. Too many roles will give some complexity in the application. And I have seen recently a customer having over 400 different roles in the application. And each of them was just a group of functionality, but a group of functionality, in my opinion, is just a duty. And I've done security implementations myself in the past, where we had about 24 countries, over 1,700 users, and still only 13 security roles. But that's not always possible to have just only 13 security roles. But you have to think of grouping things as part of a role instead of creating a security role per user in the application. Then there's always a lot of people think I want to have the least privilege, which is also very good, because if you have too much access in the application, you can do things wrong. However, you also have to think of least effort. If you really want to have the least privileges in the application, you might to do a lot of refinement to get to that level. Whereas I was always thinking of, well, I will first look at standard duties and standard privileges in the application. And if the duty is having not only the maintain rights for customers and also creating the contacts and looking at some transactions. But if that privilege would also have access to 2 reports which they didn't define, if there's no risk for the user to be able to see or use that report, why would you create a custom version of the privilege in your application? So that's the concept of least privilege versus least effort. Sometimes just having 2 menu items in addition does not really hurt in the application. And it could save a lot of time during the implementation itself. And also during the security implementation, you always have to consider the GDPR, which should have access to, for example, private information or private addresses. And also is a company required to also implement the security according to the SOX compliance. For having access to private details, there's also I wrote a blog about the private location security. You can I will share the blog later in this presentation. Then you can also read a bit more about it. Let's pause for a little moment and I will go back to the chat to see which questions were asked. There's one question from Jonas. I don't know if you will talk about it, but do you have any recommendations on security role assignment or customization in implementation projects? I think I'm talking about it, but if you have some specific questions, just please ask. Then I see someone who got kicked out. Not sure what was that. Question for Andre again from Ludwig. When should one start talking about security in a project? Well, actually, what I mentioned, in fact, before you really start the project, you already should have knowledge about how to approach the security in the application, just within the implementation. Bit of more details is like how you can start with defining the requirements for the security is to know which persons are or type of personas are used in the application and what access should they require. For example, do we have a project manager or not? Do people need to do time writing? How is the financial department organized? Which persons do have what type of duties in the company? Then you can create a kind of security matrix and know what kind of roles and contents should be in the application. Also part of the SOX compliance would be ensure that no person in the application would be able to perform the full process of procure to pay. Always ensure that there is a break in between, that probably someone was able to maintain the vendor bank accounts would not be able to generate the vendor payment journals. I see Ludwig's hand raised. Do you want to?
Yep, I have a short question. How is this handled in your company? Do you have architects that deal with these security questions before you start, or is this role specific that you say, okay, the supply chain consultant is dealing with this, and the finance consultant and maybe project consultant, everybody is dealing with this, or is this an overall task of the implementation architect, so to say?
Well, if you look at your company, well, today I'm working for an ISV partner, so we don't have to really do the implementation at the customers anymore. But indeed, when you just talk with the customer, try to find out what personas, what access they need. And it could be just in a simple Excel sheet. This person is on the finance department or this type of person, and he needs to have access on view rights for the vendors. He needs to be able to generate the payments. And another task could be creating of the vendor invoices, but that might be probably another user or type of persona. In that case, you can create a kind of matrix. And also from that matrix, you can see or check already what to do with a segregation of duties to ensure that a combination of duties would not be allowed in a certain role. Thanks for that. Question when it should, and then a comment from Jonas. I've seen issues with this many times. Security always gets the lowest priority. Indeed, I've seen that. And I have also seen that someone had everything correct in AX 2009, but when they upgraded to AX 2012, then they didn't understand the new concept and just assigned the system administrator role to anyone. And that was really a shame how they did the implementation, as they did an upgrade and thought, well, the security will be upgraded as well. However, it was not considered as part of the upgrade project plan, and in that case, they just forgot about it. Oh, and now my notes are scrolling in the wrong direction. And I think we're up to date with the questions, so I'll continue with the presentation, if you don't mind. Go to the next slide. Just an introduction of the license impact for having security roles assigned to users. First, an explanation of which license queues do we have for Dynamics 365. At the left part, a bit in the blue, all the customer engagement apps, which used to be CRM, field service, project service automation. And at the right side, everything that used to be AX and now split into finance, supply chain, commerce, and human resources. Microsoft created a licensing guide where they stated for each of this queue which security roles is part of finance, which is part of supply chain, which is part of commerce. If a user would probably only need to have the accounting manager role, then it would be just in the finance. But if the same person also would require to do some tasks on accounting journals, then in that case, he would have the requirement to have a license for both finance operations and supply chain management. However, there would be just a base license, which would be finance, and an attach, that's the lower part, a supply chain management attached license would be required for that user in that case. You can also switch it around, that the person will have a base license for the supply chain and then finance attach. But that would be just also talking with the customer and see what would be the best fit, as there's also a minimum seat requirement, so minimum of 20 users for the finance operations apps, and for human resources, it's a minimum of 5 users. And next to these full licenses and attached licenses, there are also a device license. I will skip that one in this presentation, but there's also a level of an activity user. That activity user does not exist for the customer engagement applications. And there's a concept of team members. And if you look at the pricing, just the full licenses are the most expensive ones. The activity is in the middle, and the team member is just this cheap license. And a team member would be just like being able to do some self-service or do time writing and some other tasks. But the same team member license can be used across all the Dynamics 365 applications. So if a customer has both CE and finance and operations, if there are some team member tasks required in customer engagement, the same team member license will also give access to do time writing or expense management in finance and operations. Now, coming back to the application, well, if you think I have money enough, then we might not care about the licensing part, then everyone could be having the full license in the application, but we would like to just see if we can reduce the licensing cost to check if someone would be able to have an activity or maybe a team member license. But what's the impact? It's not only about assigning the security roles, but if you change a security role or if you create new security roles in the application, in that case, there might be just an unexpected change in the license levels. Now, how does it work? In fact, what was mentioned now as part of the Dynamics 365 security, not security, licensing guide, then all security roles are listed for the applications. And in the application itself, I will go back to the simple view of having the user security roles, user privileges, and menu items. How does it work with the licensing impact? There's one table, or just in the coding of the application, Microsoft embedded a JSON file in one of the DLLs, which results in an extraction in a table in SQL, where there's a SKU name. It could be finance, HR, supply chain management, a privilege name, and also if there's a unique license requirement, yes or no. That contains all the privileges. Only the privileges as part of the full licenses. In the past, in previous versions, there were some errors that some privileges were wrong, but I think Microsoft now have it a bit under control. So that means that based on this list, if you create a security role with certain privileges or duties having those privileges, the accumulation of all those duties and underlying privileges will define what is the license requirement for the security role. And the license requirement for one role could be that it would have a finance and a requirement also for an attach, or only a finance, or only an HR, or whatever type of role. Now for the activity and the team member licenses, then there are two properties on the menu items. And the menu items are attached to privileges, and then again, what's the highest license requirement mentioned via the privileges to the duties on the security role, that will determine the license requirement. And on the menu items, there's a difference between a maintain user license and a view user license. The property values are still having the old AX2012 values, meaning that enterprise is a full license, but not a distinction if it's finance or if it's supply chain. It's just one of them, either. If there's a word called universal, universal means a team member, and activity, well, they called it just activity. That's the only consistency they have now. If there's no privilege, or if a security role is based on privileges which are not listed in that JSON file, which results in the table with the SKUs linked to the privileges, in that case, it could be that the maintain or another view user license is set to enterprise. If that's the case, then it does not matter what, but actually the user needs a full license. It could be either finance or supply chain. Then there's no real requirement for which one. But if it's an activity or if it's a universal, then it could be activity or a team member. So this just about the license impact on how it works in the architecture. What sometimes happens is that as part of a customization, it would be quite easy to create a new table, a new form. And in fact, for the new table and the new form, you don't need any license at all, according to Microsoft, as it's not related to their product, but you have an additional table. For example, you have rental objects. Now, rental objects is not something that is already part of the application itself. So you don't have any multiplexing limitations here. But sometimes developers think, hey, I will copy an existing menu item and change it according to the needs for this customization. In that case, if the developers copy such a menu item, then they also should look after what values were used by Microsoft for the maintain and the view user license. In some cases, I've seen some errors that the licensing was too high because of just a wrong copying and not paying attention to these two properties. I'll go to the next slide. Save on the license cost. It would be possible to check via the user interface. If you go to a certain role and look at all the details, then there's an option to see what's the actual license requirement, but also for each of the individual menu items, there's a list of what is the level according to the properties and the privileges in the application. Meaning that if you want to check if it would be possible to go back from a full to an activity or maybe even a team member license, you can check how many menu items do have the enterprise. If it's just a few and the user is not really requiring it, in that case you can remove it to save some cost on the licensing part. And also it's recommended if you build custom roles from scratch, or not fully from scratch, but if you want to reuse duties or privileges already available in the application, in some cases, some menu items are covered by multiple privileges or multiple duties. They can also compare which of the duties would require an enterprise or maybe a lower license level. One example I did on an AX2012 project. There's one example where the partner at that time mentioned, well, an approval of a vendor invoice or a review part is part of the accounts payable manager role, and in AX2012 there was an enterprise role. So they said, well, all your 125 users doing a review task, if the invoice was the correct one for the purchase order, should have an enterprise role. Then I said, well, I don't think that is really the case, because at that time it was just only looking at the menu items. And when we look at just only the approval parts for the menu items, it's only a self-serve. So if you create a new role with only the approval menu items, it would be just a self-serve, which was the lowest license, and not an enterprise. And then we also tried it out and found out that not only the user should have access to the approval menu items, but also the document menu item to be able to open the purchase order. And that was a functional one. But in that case, we did a direct saving of about 200,000 euros for one customer in the Netherlands. So it makes sense to check if you can lower the licenses. And in this case, the customer is already running with the application since 2013. So indirect, I think they already also with the enhancement fee, they saved about 500,000 euros by only looking at the correct role assignments, just which part of the role should be Also, if you have an ISV, a partner solution, or a customization, then check what is the license for the standard roles or just the roles provided by that application. And also I have bad experiences, not for my own ISV company where I work for now, but another partner who delivered an application where they had certain menu items added to the system user role. And as part of the menu items were set to the functional level. That was also an AX 2012 case. In that case, all of their time riders were not a self-serve user anymore, but suddenly became all a functional user. And then, well, the customer was not really happy about that situation, but we managed to find the culprit in the ISV solution, just sent a message to the partner and who delivered it, and they contacted the ISV, and it was solved quickly. But if you have a correct running licenses today, if you install an ISV partner or a customization, then also check if for the standard roles or which roles they provide didn't have any negative impact on the license requirements. And to be honest, ISV companies, just like we do, we're also listening to feedback of the customers. We had a licensing discussion also with one of our customers recently, where they asked, well, for certain parts, we are using read-only, and we think with a read-only, we don't need this license level. Are you able to review it? Then we reviewed it, and indeed the customer was correct. We could lower the licenses over there, and at that moment, we also made that customer happy again. Continuing to just what's new in finance and operations compared to older versions. In older versions, there was an option to do a security change as part of the application by just looking at the roles and make some changes. Now the security configuration form in finance and operations is just a neat overview of which roles are there, and you can just drill down to duties or privileges, and from a privilege back to a security role to get some information on this form. And also from this form you can just make changes to the configuration part, and when you make the changes you can publish those changes. The big difference here is in AX 2012, when you made changes, it directly changed also the application metadata. But now in finance operations, the development and the application is fully split, meaning that if you now publish a security configuration, it will create a runtime package on the role, which is not synced back, not automatically, to the development environment. And as mentioned before, Alex Meyer did create a tool or utility to be able to convert the configuration back into a security role in the development environment. Continuing to the next, what's new? Security diagnostics. In AX 2012, there was a security development tool which gave some insights in which menu item or which privilege, which duties should be used. In finance operations, if you go to every single form, on the options tab, there's an option to open the security diagnostics, and that will give you an insight in this form via menu item is used in these roles, these duties, and these privileges. There's one downside here. There's no visibility on the licensing impact, and also no visibility if or what is the real access level. So if there's a role, the customer service manager or the sales clerk, you don't know if that role will give maintain rights or view only rights. And you can see it a bit as part of the duty and privileges names. However, if you are able to do some overrides with the customization or a configuration, we will ensure that there was no change, changing an inquirer duty in real access for full control. So there's no real visibility here. To be able to know it, you have to go to the security configuration form or just check the Visual Studio objects. Next part, what's new? Also a security diagnostics for task recordings. Briefly mentioned it in the introduction or in the beginning of this presentation. You can start a task recording and just opening several forms in the application, which should be part of a certain role for a user. It will have a result of which menu items were used in the application. If you then assign or just open a certain user, you would see if that user will have currently access to it or not. And if not, you're able to also add some references to be able to maintain certain roles. Another thing, what's new? You're able to copy roles from one user to another. So if there's a new user in the system, like for example, Jurgen would replace Ievgen, then it is possible to go to the user form of Jurgen, assign roles to user, but then there would be a list of all security roles initially. But if you then specify in the ID field the user, which would be a reference for assigning the security roles, you get a limited list of roles currently assigned to the old user. And you can also enable the option to include the organizations. So it would also copy also the legal entity context. As last, there's an audit trail also available in finance and operations for security roles only, meaning that there would be a kind of limited information what changes were done in the application. So this is also an option to check what changes were done via the application or what changes were done as part of the configuration in the application, but that's not replacing the version control as mentioned if we want to go back to an older version. For that purpose, we have DevOps where we can go back or just look at really the details what was done in the past or just retrieve an older version. And if we have a storage for all of the security configurations moved from one development environment to a test and then a production environment, then we will also have an option to go back and see what happened. But this form gives a bit of overview of where are the changes as part of a security change or maybe an update. Something about the forgotten, hidden and unknown features. Not hidden, for sure not hidden in the application, but many times forgotten is the segregation of duties. It would be just an additional help for resolving conflicting access, like a user should not be able to create vendor bank accounts or maintain them, and also create payment journals. Because if he would be able to do it, he would be able to control also the bank account where the money will be transferred to. It could be his own bank account. So the segregation of duties would be able to be useful to prevent fraud in the application. But if you look at the segregation of duties, it's also called segregation of duties, and Microsoft implemented it on the duty level only, meaning that duty maintain vendor bank accounts and duty maintain vendor payments. That's the level what you can set up in the application. But if someone will add new duties or new privileges or create new menu items for certain elements, in that case, it will not be recognized on the duty level. And also for that reason, it's not really recommended to assign privileges directly on security roles if there would be a need to have segregation of duties in the standard application. We have an ISV solution where we have an enhanced segregation of duties, which is also being able to set up the segregation of duties on the privilege or menu item level. But keep in mind, if you want to use the standard, if you are doing it on the segregation of duties, it's only on the duty level, and what's below it, if there's any changes or additions, then it will not be recognized automatically. Also, if you are using the segregation of duties, that segregation of duties is not supported together with the users of the Azure Active Directory groups. Because if you are using the standard way of having the Azure Active Directory groups, then on a group level you define the security permissions, and the users will only have information in Azure Active Directory to which groups they belong. If they are logging in, they will inherit the security access from that groups, but there's no direct group assignment. And in that case, it will not be able to detect if there would be conflicting access. So if you are in the need for having segregation of duties, the standard way of Azure Active Directory groups is not useful. But again, also in our ISV solution, we have a solution for that. Also sometimes forgotten, but also a bit of unknown. And if people know that it exists, then they still don't know how to deal with it. That's called an extensible data security. As mentioned in the beginning, it would be possible to restrict access to certain records. Extensible data security was introduced in AX 2012 as a replacement for the older record level permissions, which is also called RLS. The record level permission was implemented on a kind of filtering on forms, and extensible data security is implemented on the AOS level, meaning that it will always be enforced before it will retrieve data from the database, whereas the old version was just retrieving all the information, or possible to retrieve all the information and filter only on the forms, where if people would have in another way access to the table, would still see all information. Also, if you define certain security groups in AX 2009 and had the same menu item used on multiple security groups, in that case you also had to apply it per table, per group, what to do with that record level security. And with extensible data security, it's just if it's restricted, then if there's another role where it might have more access compared to the extensible data security policy used, then still it will be enforced to have the minimum access on the records. So it can be used on rows in tables, but also related tables. With the record level security, you always had to do it per table. And with the security policy, we can set up just one policy stating that a customer is not, or just a user is not allowed to see anything related to a customer group 20. So there's a primary table secured called customer groups. And if you then link related tables like the customers, maybe the sales orders, sales order lines, then they will also be automatically constrained with the same policy. Also, with the extensible data security, it's possible to not only define which records will be visible, so the read access, but also create, update, and delete levels for security are supported with the extensible data security. So it would be possible to create a policy where a person can see records, but not able to create or update or delete a certain set of records based on the contents of the table. meaning that probably if a sales person is responsible for sales in a specific region or for a specific customer group, then he can only enter sales orders as part of his group and not able to change anything for other groups. Then he has to interact with or the manager or maybe a colleague. Also, extensible data security is more powerful as it will enforce data really on the AOS level before the data will be retrieved from the database. And it's in fact easier to implement compared to record level permissions, but be aware of possible performance issues if you do a wrong query or just a too extensive query for having a restriction on tables, then it might cause some performance issues. And I did another presentation in the past also fully about extensible data security with also some tips how to mitigate or just avoid performance issues. The next one, if you open the assign users to security roles form, then most of the people would just select a role, go to the lower part and assign users to that role. But even there is the grid at the top, really a lot of people forget about it or just overlook it and don't know what to do with it. But it's an option to specify rules for automatically assigning users to that specific rule, meaning that maybe what I achieved also in the past is if someone has a position in HR and that position has also is referenced by other positions as it reports to, meaning that he is the manager of other persons. If somewhere that person was recognized as a manager based on the position assignments, then the manager role was added automatically. But you can also use it for many other rules to automatically assign the roles in the application. At several implementations, I also used it, and for one customer we were able to use it only on assigning users automatically via rules in the application, and over there it was not allowed, only the exception of system administrators to assign the roles manually. It was all done automatically, where it was just easy also for maintenance of users and security administration. Also something, and I think I have to skip this now, as I just found out recently that currently the data effective access is not working. At least it is not working in the environment I just tested recently. However, at least in AX2012 and also earlier versions of Dynamics 365, it was possible to set data effective access, for example, on the workers or maybe position assignments, where it would be possible to have an assistant able to see only current active positions and current active workers in the application, and an HR manager was able to see also what are the future and the past assignments and what were the past users. That could also be used also for GDPR regulations, where probably certain users will not be able to see the past workers and for that reason also don't have access to them anymore. However, I just found out recently, and I'm in contact with Microsoft to be able to check if I did something wrong in my environment or if it's just a specific version or maybe if there's a broader issue. But in the past, it used to work. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Now I have to check if there are new questions in the meeting chat.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of questions. So,
Yes, I see another question from Ludwig. Again, general question to, there's a question to all. Does your company have somebody who regularly checks licenses? If it's, it could possibly, for the cost impact. That's also funny, probably also how to deal with it. We got another prospect interesting in our solution for security and compliance. And they also asked us, can you do something with a service, a kind of license cost saving as a service? But then we did a kind of quick assessment what they did or what they had done. They created a lot of additional rules, and they asked us, would it be possible for these rules to do any cost saving? Well, then I did a quick assessment on what's the name of the security role, and they had just a prefix for the company and a kind of similar role name as defined in the licensing guide and as part of the standard roles in the application. So then I just quickly verified if there's just company underscore accounting manager. That was a finance, so we could skip that one. And also, I tried to match how many users were assigned to a certain role. And then I created a diagram of which security roles are just in advance known as being just a full license. Skip that part. Only the ones with the question marks or where I think maybe it should be standard operations, but if they changed certain things and added duties, which is on a full license, in that case, it should be just investigated. And then we only mentioned, well, all user, if you have more than 5 users, then it would be just possible to just look at it for an initial review, and maybe for all other roles where you only have one person assigned, maybe in that case we can look at it next year. But in that case, we had defined about 13 roles which potentially could have a license saving. So that's also an option to check. Well, if Microsoft intended to have the accounting manager as a full license, well, then we can start arguing it. But there's no way to get a lower license.
okay. And then I think the other question was about XDS and whether you see this often or seldom, because I think Lone replied that she has done that or seen that.
Yeah, we worked with that in Denmark, and I know Jonas also did. We worked in the same company in Denmark, so yeah.
Okay, well, I used it myself in about half of the implementations I did. It was not always required, but in AX 2012, if you used the address book security in the background, it was also using XDS policies. The address book security is not available in the standard application Dynamics 365, not today. I had contact with Microsoft many times about it, also for several years. And about 2 years ago, I had a talk with them and said, hey, if you can do it in a quick way, in this way, would that be something you can deliver or not? And then they said, well, no, we would go for a final good solution if we are going to do it again, but it's not announced as deprecated, so it should still be brought to Dynamics 365. But then I said, well, I can do it in the way I can propose and share it with the community. So also that I have posts on my blog where you can download objects to get started with the address book security again back in finance on operations. And also I created some examples also for a lot of people to get started with the extensible data security. And I've seen also performance issues, but then you have to check if you can implement it in a bit different way. But also one customer had some customizations, and for that reason they had already some performance issues. Then they had an additional requirement. Well, we don't want to see all of the vendors or all of the customers. Then we implemented a specific policy to just limit the data. And somehow the SQL Server did look at it in a different way, created a fully different query plan. And also their current performance issue was solved with just by implementing XTS. So it can also be the other way around.
That's good, yeah.
But do I remember correct that for custom fields, XTS doesn't work? Jonas, I think you might also remember that we had that on a customer.
Yeah, the custom fields is if you create a security policy and have the custom field as part of your Visual Studio development. I have not tried it actually, but if you have the custom fields as part of the configuration, then indeed for sure that those custom fields as part of the configuration are not known in Visual Studio. Yeah. But if you created a table extension in Visual Studio, I have not tried it myself yet. But if you have some experiences where it's not working, I would like to try it out as well, just to check what are the limitations or in this area.
Yes.
Kind of advocate of just promoting XCS.
Yeah, because we had a specific customer that they were always trying to do the standard way, but they had used a couple of custom fields, and then they wanted to implement the XDS, and they had to change the use of the custom fields to a what is it called, normal a finance and operations field, and then they could use it.
Okay.
But you had a slide with the security role for approving invoices. We had also the exact same scenario at customers in Denmark, trying to find the lowest license and figuring out how to do that right. So one of the first questions when implementing a vendor invoice workflow would always be, do the approvers have to be, should they be able to correct the...
That's correct, yeah. So, yeah. If they just only have the approval task, then it's a lower license. But if they are able to just correct information and change an ledger account, then they have to change the journal line. And if they change the journal line, it's a full license. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. And for saving licenses, I worked for some years in a company with 2,500 users in AX12, and we had internal IT audit. So security was a big issue, and we also did, if the users, we extracted the users and the log so we could see when they last logged in. And if they hadn't logged in, we kicked them out of the system. Then they could apply for it when they needed it.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Well, that's also what I forgot about mentioning on the slides. There's also a functionality in finance and operations, also new, a dormant user report. So that will provide information which users did not access the application for a longer time.
Yeah.
I have to adjust my slides. Apologies. Yeah.
Yeah, but at least you mentioned. I did not know about this report.
Actually, it's there, and for your or all the information. Yes, this is correct. For just generic information from for the security architecture from Microsoft, you can go to docs.microsoft.com and read about the security architecture. To get some additional help, I have an own blog site called dynamicspedia.com. If you do dynamicspedia.com/security, you get a landing page with all the security topics I wrote about. And similar from Alex Meyer, he also has a landing page for security topics where he wrote a lot about security from his point of view. And he also created a really nice blog about the current state of the user licensing, also explaining with a diagram how it really works when looking at the privilege-based or menu item-based licensing part. It would be really recommended to read that as well.
Yeah. Perfect. I also put your blog in the chat and your LinkedIn profile,
That's good.
so people can connect.
That's perfect. And thank you for attending, and also thank you for listening. And I noticed that one person needed to drop off, so I will forgive him. But thanks to all of you for not dropping off and listening to my story.
Tomorrow we can sleep a bit longer, at least some of us.
Some of you.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So Lone, my job is then to stop the recording again, right?
Yes, you can stop the recording, and then we can say whatever we want.